Well, g'day and welcome to this week's edition of the Lyle Shelton Show, coming to you from the Good Source. I'm sorry I'm doing things on the run a bit. It's been a busy week. I've been at the Human Rights Commission, accused of vilification by a couple of drag queens who are threatening to take me to the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal for allegedly offending them and vilifying them because I've said they are dangerous role models for children. I'll have some more of that in next week's show, but this week I want to show you an interview that I did with a Baptist pastor up in Cairns, Pastor Jaira Shoewater at the Cairns Baptist Church, and he graciously interviewed me for about 40 minutes or so at one of their Sunday PM services about why Christians should engage in politics and what are some of the pitfalls and landmines, and whether or not our engagement, particularly on thorny issues such as same-sex marriage, drag queens, whether that sends a message to our friends in the LGBT community that they're not welcome in our churches. I'm sure you'll find the discussion interesting. Sit back, stay tuned and enjoy. I'll be back after this.
Without any further ado, I want to introduce you to a man who has been described as the mild-mannered church worker who ran for council on a high and mighty platform of objecting to pornography, pokies, strippers and prostitution. He was Ned Flanders with a country Queensland twang, thin and neatly dressed with a good-natured grin. Lyle, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Where did you dig that up from?
A great little piece from Lek Blaine from April.
I've great respect for Lek. Politically, we're on the opposite sides, but he's a very good writer and a very thoughtful interviewer.
Awesome. How do you feel about the Ned Flanders persona?
Look, I think that's a little bit of, in due respect to Lek, a bit of a cheap shot. I mean, that's a caricature from the Simpsons. And look, I guess that's how some people try and characterise us Christians. I'll let people watch this this show, and they can be the judge of whether I'm Ned Flanders or someone a little bit more cooler than that.
No problems. Look, that he does harken back in that article that I just referenced. He does harken back to those very early days for you. Now, you haven't always been the Lyle Shelton we know now, the former chair of the ACL. You were at one point a youth pastor in your father's church.
Yeah, I was, and Lek, who wrote that for the Monthly magazine, which is a prominent left-wing journal. I actually like reading the Monthly. It's very well written. I don't agree with a lot of what's in there, but it's thoughtful content, and Lek is a thoughtful writer. So he's from the same hometown that I'm from, and Toowoomba has very much shaped me as it shaped him, although we've ended up on different ends of the political spectrum. But yeah, I worked as a youth pastor in my dad's church. My earliest memories as a child in Toowoomba were being in church meetings, and I grew up in the church. I love the church, and it was a privilege to serve as a youth pastor in Toowoomba City Church for 3 years. But I had politics in my blood, and with the church's support, I ran for council in the year 2000, and it's not the greatest reference or platform for which to run for political office that your last job was as a youth pastor in a Pentecostal church. In secular Australia, that is a little bit of an oddity.
Yep.
But I didn't hide that fact. I'd also had a professional career as a journalist for 6 years,
Yep.
and I had a degree in journalism from the local uni in Toowoomba. So I did mention that and probably highlight that a little, but I didn't hide the youth pastor aspect of it. I was very proud to have been elected, with people knowing that I was an out and proud Christian.
Yeah, awesome. So being a youth pastor myself, how did dealing with a group of teenagers prepare you for a life in politics?
Look, it was good because it helped keep me in touch with youth culture, as I'm sure it does to you. I'm more and more out of touch with youth culture. It's a moving feast. But what you learn organisationally and running events and marketing and all those sort of skills, as well as obviously staying close to God, those skills are really important in politics.
No problems. Hey, let's talk about those early years. I mean, your first foray into politics, if you will, was on the Toowoomba City Council.
Yes, sort of. Well, actually, and this didn't make it into the book because the book's not necessarily an autobiography,
Yep.
but my first foray into politics was in student politics. So when I was at University of Southern Queensland, I ran for a position on the council of the student union and got elected. So that was my first electoral success. And I was there with a whole bunch of, hard left, atheist, socialist people, and I loved every one of them. And, they knew I was a Christian, and I love being a Christian in a so-called secular space, and learning to work with people on issues of common concern. And so that, in a lot of ways, did prepare me a lot for what I was to do about 10 years later when I ran for council.
Yeah, okay. So tell me about the student politic angle. How did that shape you as an individual? So you were in uni at the time, I'm assuming.
Yes, I was second year at uni into my journalism degree. I'd been interested in politics since I was a kid, and thought deeply about issues. I had grown up in the church world, so and gone to a Christian school, and no regrets about any of that. But I always had played football, so I had interaction with non-Christians. I wasn't naive about the world, but had grown up in a Christian bubble. So being at uni, being involved in student politics there, having had somewhat of a sheltered life, but not completely, it was good for me to just learn the skills that I needed to understand how people who were outside of the church bubble thought and what motivated them, and to learn to navigate my way through that and develop relationships and friendships. And some of those friendships last to this day, even though they may not have agreed with my faith and some of the issues that I stood for. I'm pleased to say that I had great respect from people, if not agreement, and some of those relationships have endured decades, and I'm thankful to God for that, and that's something I've always valued, my relationships with people wherever possible, even if we've been on the opposite side of sometimes even very controversial and heated debates. So
did you find your time in student governance, was this something that was this a nicer playing field perhaps? Is this a place that you would encourage others to really get into to develop that side of their personality?
Yeah, look, politics isn't everyone's bag, but there are some people like me who are just political nerds. And I started reading the Australian newspaper as a teenager. Okay,
wow. So no girlfriend?
Well, that came later. And luckily she's still my girlfriend today. We're married. But look, I would encourage anyone who is interested in politics. And look, I've been in and out of elected office. I'm not in elected office at the moment, but I've been a political activist and around politics my whole life. Student politics is definitely the way to cut your teeth. I mean, if you look at some of our prime ministers that we've had, Bob Hawke and Tony Abbott, Peter Costello, these guys all cut their teeth in student politics. Get in early, learn how it works. It's all the same. It's all Machiavellian. It's all very dirty and distasteful. There's betrayals and drama. It doesn't matter whether at uni or whether you're on a Toowoomba City Council or whether you're in federal parliament. The knives are often out, and you've got to learn how to navigate those spaces. So I would certainly encourage any Christian, don't be afraid of it. Embrace it, lean into it, and learn how people who are different to us as Christians think. And because the amazing thing is that there's a lot more commonality than we realize. Okay, we believe in Jesus, and we believe in our faith and cultivating that relationship with him, and the importance of the scriptures. And then how do we apply what we believe in our worldview, which is informed by the scriptures? It's motivated by the same thing as so many other people of goodwill in public life, and that is the common good. And we come from a Christian framework, do unto others as you would have them done unto you, love your neighbour. That's the basis of the Christian ethos into the public square. And you'll find that a lot of people who are of goodwill are motivated by the same thing, just from a different worldview. So there's commonality, and find the common ground and work with people. You'd be surprised where that commonality lies.
Well, let me ask you then around that as well. I mean, you're not currently, as you mentioned before when we were talking a little bit off air, you're not currently a politician, but you're still working in political circles.
Yep.
So if I can maybe just use that word, though, perhaps out of context just for a moment, would you just describe yourself as a Christian politician or a politician who was a Christian?
I would describe myself as a Christian political activist who's a wannabe politician, and I've run for office a few times. I've run unsuccessfully at state parliament, unsuccessfully last year for the federal Senate.
Yep.
But I see myself as a Christian first, in the same way that I think, perhaps my ideological opponents, and let's choose, say the Greens political party, they would see themselves not as a politician who's a Green, they would see themselves as a Green who is a politician. And the Greens have a worldview which I would say is just as religious in its philosophy and underpinnings as Christianity is. In fact, to the point where people like Bob Brown talk about the transcendent concepts like Gaia, that's a form of God, it's some sort of spiritual entity that's at the heart of Greens philosophy. Not many people know that, but Bob Brown, the former leader of the Greens political party, openly talks about Gaia. So this is this quasi-spirit. It's not even quasi. It is spiritual.
Sure.
We come from a spiritual basis as well, through the Almighty God and His Son Jesus Christ, who we believe to be God and Lord and King over all the earth. That's the perspective that we bring into politics. The Greens bring Gaia into politics and a form of pantheism, which is creation worship. It is very religious. It's not new. It's essentially an ancient religion rebadged. So yes, I see myself as a Christian bringing that worldview into politics, and the Greens are free to bring their religious worldview into politics, and guess what? They do.
Sure. I mean, I would like to think, in my naivety perhaps, that our politicians are a group of people who are looking toward the betterment of our society. But I mean, the way you describe it there, it seems like a clash of ideology.
Absolutely. Politics is it's war. It's the way that civilized people do war. It is a clash of ideas. And again, this is, it bothers me that so few people know our history and know about our civic institutions. So, our parliament is designed as an adversarial system. Instead of people killing each other on the battlefield, we decided hundreds of years ago through medieval Britain that we needed a parliament. It's not a good idea to get your swords out and slash each other to death, or pull out pistols and have a duel to settle your problem. So the parliament...
Although apparently knives in the back are okay.
Well, yeah, metaphoric, they do. There's a lot of blood on the floor, metaphorical blood on the floor. But at least it's metaphorical, not real. In some countries it's real. And up until hundreds of years ago, until the British developed the Westminster system of parliament, which is the basis of Australia's system. America borrowed from that. All the modern democracies have some sort of a variation of this, and that's what civilized the world. And what people don't realise is that the dispatch boxes in both the Senate and the House of Representatives are 2 sword lengths apart. Yep. Now there's a reason for that. It's because we don't fight with swords anymore. Yet there is a clash of ideology. Bring your clash of ideas to the parliament. Now, what we've seen happen in recent times is a rising militant secularism that says, no, we don't want Christians in the public square. You have no right to be here. Don't bring your worldview. You're not even allowed to bring it into the place. You're not even allowed to come to the fight. We want to cancel you first because we think you're bad people. Sure. Therefore, you should be cancelled. And that's where we are at the moment. This moment in history. It's a very dangerous period for Christians because our elites in the media and academia no longer consider us to have a valid point of view that is even worthy of being dignified in terms of bringing something to the argument.
Okay, so as the faith that, as the shield that goes before you in terms of your faith and your ideology that you stand behind, how much of that, how much of your time in the church or your faith has shaped why you go into where you do, why you go into politics? How much of that is shaped by your faith?
Everything.
Sure.
Look, I am who, it's my identity in the same way that my friends, from the LGBTIQ community, who were perhaps the most fiercest political activists of the last 10 years, they bring what they call, and this is their words, not mine. This is our identity. This is what we bring to politics, and they brought it to politics and brought about, probably the most momentous change, and one that is going to have far-reaching consequences, which we're only just scratching the surface of now, in terms of redefining marriage and gender and what it is to be a human creature. They've completely upended all that in law because they brought their identity to the political table. Now, they're welcome to do that. It's a democracy. So in the same way that they do, or that Bob Brown brings Gaia to the table, I bring Jesus to the table.
Okay. So
but can I just say, for most people up until 5 minutes ago in our history, they considered Jesus of Nazareth to be the greatest moral teacher of all time. Many people still believe that, whether they are Christian or not. So you ask what shapes me. Yes, the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, I think is the greatest moral teaching of all time. It influenced Gandhi, it influenced Martin Luther King Jr. It's been the motivating force for some of the greatest political change and movements for good that history has ever seen.
Understandably. I mean, it also has its other side, though. It's also been responsible for some of the most horrendous sacking of societies as well. The Crusades weren't exactly a great time in our history.
Well, look, no, they weren't. There are aspects of the Crusades which were brutal. And I'm not across all of the history of this, but there is another side to the Crusades as well. Don't remember that the Muslims back in those times were not passive either. They made it all the way to the gates of Vienna, and they took one of the great Christian areas, Constantinople, and turned the Church of the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church of antiquity, into of the Christian era, into a mosque. They were going through Europe raping and pillaging. The Crusades were they were in part a desire to go and reconquer the Holy Land. But there was also a defensive aspect of it, that they didn't want Europe to be overrun by Islam. Now, in those days, again, different times, and we've got to be careful about judging previous generations by our standards today. And I'm not trying to defend the barbarian. There were some barbarous acts done in the Crusades, no doubt. There were some barbarous acts done by the Muslims. There are nuances to this story, and I think it's wrong just to stereotype it and say Christians, always got it wrong with the Crusades. They got some things wrong. There was some barbarism, but it was also a battle to make sure that Christian Europe wasn't lost.
A complex story, no doubt, and there is a whole lot more to that. But let's talk about Lyle Shelton, the individual, for a moment. How much of your, going back to where you started your faith journey, if I can go back there, how much was shaped by your parents and growing up in the church? How much was shaped, where did you have your realization where God became personal to you?
Yeah, it was very much shaped by my parents, my family, my upbringing. As I said earlier, my earliest memories were, lying on a blanket in church meetings. So look, I grew up in the faith. My dad was a pastor from when I was about 4 or 5 years old, maybe 5 or 6. He became a pastor. He left his farm to go to Bible college. Felt God's call to go into the ministry. So, yeah, that shaped me. And probably about the age of 6, in a kids ministry environment. And I know you here at Cairns Baptist have an amazing kids program. I saw that on display this morning in church, and never underestimate the power of that. I mean, that kids ministry touched my heart as a 6-year-old. Now, obviously, it had the foundation through the home, but I had to make my own personal decision for Jesus. And I remember doing that in a kids ministry event at the age of 6. Now, was I a perfect child? Far from it. I could be a very naughty boy. Not the Messiah, I was a naughty boy. But it doesn't mean perfection, but I just knew from a young age that Jesus was real. He was real in my life, and when I'd go off the rails, I kept coming back to him. But as I went through my teenage years, obviously you question things, you do your own research. I did a lot of reading, apologetics, Christian worldview sort of thing, secular reading. I went to uni, and the 3 years at uni really tested my faith, because intellectually we were fed a lot of Marxism and feminist ideology, which challenged my Christian worldview, and I had to really be sure of where I stood in the face of these very powerful ideologies that were being put to us through the university. I
guess I ask this question because for anybody that's looking to as you say in your book, you hope to inspire a generation of Christian activists. For anyone looking to follow in your footsteps, I mean, they're going to face a lot of opposition. And I think it's only right to say their faith will at times be tested.
Absolutely.
How do you keep your faith grounded? And I want to ask this question in light. So I have a quote here from back from 2015 from Alex Greenwich. He says about you, he says, Lyle strikes me as more of a political operator than someone who is driven by faith. He seems to enjoy the wheeling and dealing of power. To not just be attacked for your political views, but also on a basis of your faith. I mean, how do you stay grounded?
Yeah, that's a funny quote from Alex. Alex, for your viewers who don't know, he was one of the most prominent leaders of the Yes campaign for same-sex marriage. He's a politician in the New South Wales Parliament. I've met him on many occasions. We've talked, we've shook hands. That quote is amusing to me, that I enjoy wielding power. I was a mere lobbyist for the Australian Christian Lobby, the most marginalised lobby group in the country.
But also, some would suggest one of the most influential lobbyist groups.
We had some influence, but we certainly didn't wield power,
Sure.
and we were ignored more times than we had influence. If only we had the influence that Alex had. So that's why I find it amusing. I mean, those guys crushed us in the plebiscite. They had the media just on side. They were the mouse that roared. Look, your question: how do you stay grounded? Look, that's your day-by-day walk with Jesus. Most days, I'd love to say every day, but I try and get up in the morning, pray, spend some time in prayer and reading the Bible, and reorientating myself in prayer with God and with the Word of God, which I believe is the ultimate truth. And that's what keeps my day grounded. Then, of course, being involved in my local church and small groups and with other Christian people, and then your own reading theology and things like that, which help you stay on, and having good mentors in your life as well.
Yep. How do you feel? Do you think that Christian political activism can do harm to the church that is trying to simply preach the gospel?
I think the church that is just preaching the gospel and not engaging all of life does harm to the gospel. Now,
okay.
That's a controversial statement.
Sure.
Because don't get me wrong, preaching the message of personal salvation is absolutely crucial. I mean, that's where it starts for all of us, as it did for me as a 6-year-old. And at whatever point in life someone comes to faith in Jesus Christ, that's obviously important, and it's because someone has preached the word and they've heard it and the Holy Spirit has activated faith in their hearts. But that's just where it starts. And I think as a church we have done the gospel a disservice by truncating the gospel. We have stopped at just preaching personal salvation. We've bought into the great lie of the Enlightenment, which 200 to 300 years ago, as science was on the rise, and the French philosophers and all this great intellectual philosophizing that was going on, which said, okay, we can tolerate the church, but because we're now people of science and not superstition and breaking with the medieval period, we're going to put God upstairs, and if you want to worship God, that's great, have your churches, God's up there, but down here is the realm of the mind, the intellect of science, and we're going to run this in a secular way that divorces all that from God. Now, the fruit of that has been that our society has drifted away from God. We've lost our moral roots, and we are now aimless as a civilization, and we're in very grave danger of becoming an uncivil society, because we're not rooted in the virtues that come as a result of what Christianity brings to individuals and then to the society. And the church has bought into that lie. We've said, yeah, okay, we'll just do our thing in our four walls of the church, maybe do a bit of evangelism, do some good works, charity, look after the poor. All of that's great, not diminishing that, but the gospel goes beyond that. One of the most famous Christmas carols, and I mentioned this in the book, is Joy to the World. It says, He rules the world with truth and grace. Your King has come. That's the message of Christmas. The King has come as a little baby in a manger, not as some Machiavellian guy with force, but as a humble servant leader, but nonetheless a king. And that's Christ's claim. And the church has stopped proclaiming Christ's kingship. That's what got the church into trouble with the Romans in the early days, because they said, yes, we respect the governing authorities and we obey them, but we serve another Lord, and it's not Caesar. And that's why they were persecuted. We're not as persecuted because we haven't been proclaiming the kingship and lordship of Christ.
To take you back though, I mean, Luther himself, so the guy that started the greatest of revolutions, if you will, Luther proclaimed that society need not be run by the church in order to be ruled by God. He also suggested that whilst it would be more desirable if more people turned to the Bible every day, he says the gospel has nothing to do with about traffic rules, or, to paraphrase him, illegal immigration, the price of petrol. The gospel, he says, is the good news of salvation through Christ. It's Christians' highest good. Now, Luther is not Jesus. I'm not suggesting that for a second. But Luther also advocated to take the church out of politics at the time. You suggest we need to put it back in?
I don't think we should have a theocracy, but I think if Bob Brown can bring Gaia and a pantheistic worldview to the Parliament of Australia, and if the Greens political party can do that, why can't I bring a worldview that's motivated by love for neighbour and justice and truth that's motivated from the Christian religion? Why can't that be brought to the table? Now, I think where Luther got it wrong is
brave man that says Luther got it wrong.
Look, I think Luther got a lot of things right,
Sure.
obviously. None of us have got everything right. But Luther was reacting against a Roman Catholic Church that had become incredibly corrupt. It was entwined with the state in those days. And he was calling people back to that personal relationship with Christ. He wasn't trying to leave the Catholic Church even. He was just saying Christianity is a religion of the heart. We need to get back to knowing Jesus. And he was dead right. But the overemphasis of that has been to then decouple justice. See, politics, whether it's managing traffic properly or whatever, it's about bringing order to a chaotic world. And when Jesus says, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven," he's saying, bring the order of heaven to earth, not chaos. So that's why Christianity does apply to, in my case when I was in local government, it matters that there's a sewage system, because that brings hell and chaos if there's a lack of hygiene in a city, if the traffic doesn't work properly. These are kingdom of God values of order. And you look at countries that don't have a Christian worldview, where they don't value order, there's chaos. Now, I think Christianity has brought civilization to the world, firstly starting in England and then moving out across the globe to countries that have adopted had a Christian basis of their politics. It's brought incredible good. It's been the biggest force for good. Despite our mistakes, it's been the biggest force for good of anything. And I think we ignore that at our peril. And that's why I think a Christian worldview in politics is absolutely vital.
Sure.
Because the alternative is chaos. And we're seeing that now as alternative worldviews are manifesting in the political system. Look at the Marxist worldview that's being brought to the Black Lives Matter protests.
Yep. I mean, when we talk about chaos, that's a fair question. I guess one of my next questions was going to be around the fact that if you put 3 different churches in a room, you get 3 different opinions and 3 different beliefs in some ways around a singular topic. I mean, if as the church capital C in Australia can't agree on some of these issues, how hard is it then to have a unified voice on behalf of Christian activists within politics?
Yeah, look, it is difficult. I think despite the dysfunction that does exist in the church in Australia, it's not the church is not a perfect entity. It's not even one entity as such. It's got many facets. But I think on the whole, and I discovered this over 10 years working at Australian Christian Lobby, is the majority of the church does agree on the basics of Christian faith and Christian morals and how that should apply. So an organisation like ACL has grown very rapidly over the last 10 or 20 years, and not that, it's not about numbers, although numbers have their place, but I think there is an agreement, and there certainly was, as the church belatedly came into the marriage campaign, realising that, hey, we do need to stand up for God's definition for marriage as between a man and a woman. There wasn't much disagreement. I mean, there are elements of the Uniting Church that disagreed, some fringe elements of the Anglican Church, but by and large, whether you're Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Seventh-day Adventist, Baptist, Pentecostal, and the list goes on, those groups were all very united in saying, no, hang on, it is wrong for our society to change the definition of marriage.
In your book, you talk a little bit about, you are a little bit critical of the church for coming late to the party on the same-sex marriage debate. For the churches that were at ground level, how do you think that impacted their ability to maintain an open door policy for any sinner to come into the building and be loved? I mean, don't get me wrong, God's word is God's word. No one is trying to take away from that. But do you think that made it harder for churches during that period to be able to have an open door policy to the world?
It should never have made it harder to... look, Christianity is always the tension between truth and grace. And we never shy away as Christians from proclaiming the truth, even though they are unpopular truths, and then having grace for the sinner. The thing that grieved me the most about the gay marriage debate, and look, our opponents were very clever. They characterised this not in terms of the merits or otherwise of the argument. they somehow managed to pigeonhole us in the media as bad people because we didn't agree with their political agenda, which meant we must hate them and must be bigoted.
Yep.
I never hated anyone who's gay or has a different view of human sexuality to me, but I do disagree with them on public policy because I think there are unjust consequences that flow from redefining marriage. But they didn't want to have that debate. They didn't want to talk about how this could affect the lives of children, or how this would affect freedom of speech and freedom of religion. They just wanted to say, no, you're just an evil person, you're a bigot. So sadly, a lot of churches bought into that narrative and thought, well, if we don't support gay marriage, that means we're rejecting gay people and that they're not welcome in our churches. Rubbish. Gay people should always be welcome in our churches. Liars and cheats. And this is where it gets controversial, because we say that homosexuality is a sin in the same way that having sex outside of marriage is a sin. It's not that we're hung up about homosexual sex. Christians, if I can use that parlance, I hope none of us are hung up about sex. It's a beautiful, wonderful thing. But we as Christians believe that there is a moral framework around sex. Now, that's unpopular today. People don't like to talk about morals. The sexual revolution says there are no morals. Whatever feels good, do it. We say, no, there's consequences for that are negative, and that if you want to have a truly flourishing sexual part of your life, this is the way it should be ordered, and the Bible prescribes that. And I think there's lots of evidence to say that actually does bring great joy and great happiness, and that the other way of doing things brings great heartache. But of course, that's all gone by the wayside, and then somehow, homosexuality's got hung up on all that, and somehow Christians have ended up being bigots and wowsers because we don't support sexual expressionism and anything goes. So it's a complicated thing, but we have a different view of how flourishing in this area works. It doesn't mean we hate people, but it's been characterised that way, and we should never have allowed ourselves to buy into that narrative, but sadly much of the church did.
Do you think that Christians were forced in some ways to take either a full view, either left or right? Do you think there was room in the centre?
What do you mean by the centre?
So I guess one of the questions around the same-sex marriage debate that I dealt with in my own ministry was a person that was going through same-sex attraction. So the issue of gay or straight was a little bit fluid to them in that particular time. They knew what the scriptures say, they knew what their upbringing said, they knew what God said, but they were dealing with an issue that for them was very real. Now, unfortunately, it felt a little bit to that person like they had to either choose to be fully on the side of the same-sex marriage debate, no, or fully on the yes, and they felt ostracized, and they didn't feel welcome in the church as a result of that.
Well, I think it's terrible if churches made them not feel welcome. Their struggles is a different issue to the public policy issue. I
don't think that was the church that was making them feel unwelcome. I think that was where public policy was at the time. I think that was where the media was at the time.
And I think this is the issue. I mean, people struggle with all manner of things. Again, I don't want to be hung up on the issue of homosexuality.
Sure. No,
people struggle with, and again, people who are not Christians don't identify with this because sin is not a thing, but sin is a thing as Christians because we want to live virtuous and holy lives that please God. All of us fail in many ways, of course we do. That's why we need the cross and the grace of Christ. But the disappointing thing about this is that I think a lot of churches bought into what we now call identity politics. So if someone's identity is tied up in this, and the public policy is perceived to be an affront to their identity, that's where the conundrum goes. I think we've got to separate the public policy from the struggles that individuals have over whatever it is, and then look at it dispassionately and say, okay, what will this public policy change do to our nation? And from my point of view, forget about whether someone's struggling with same-sex attraction or not, and I'm not trying to diminish that struggle. Sure. I'm more interested in, if we change the definition of marriage, what does that mean for children? Because two blokes, if they have marriage, they have to then have access to children. And the gay lobby expects that. And so I say this in the book, Tim Wilson, who is gay, a member of the Liberal Party, when he was Human Rights Commissioner, he put out a taxpayer-funded paper about gay rights, which said that to achieve marriage equality, we need to have commercial surrogacy. Now, this is in a government report. Now, you will find hard left-wing feminists who will have common cause with people like me over commercial surrogacy. And I think most mainstream Australians would, because that means a rental market in women's wombs, and it means a commercial baby trade where babies are exchanged for money so that two blokes can have a baby. So forget it, whether someone's struggling with same-sex attraction feels welcome in the church, that's one issue. Changing the definition of marriage to create an injustice for a child, an egregious injustice, this is the sleight of hand that was committed. And a lot of Christians fell into the trap of getting tied up in the identity politics and thinking, well, I don't want to be seen as a bigot or someone who hates, my fellow Australians because they're same-sex attracted. And they couldn't then focus on the evil injustice, and I will call it evil because the feminists would also call a trade in women's wombs and human babies as evil. It is something we should not go to as a society, but it is the next thing that the same-sex marriage lobby want. It is the next political demand, and there's already pressure now. Some states, in fact, have already legalised commercial surrogacy. It's not in every state. There should be a prohibition on commercial surrogacy. So we can never achieve marriage equality. What happened in that plebiscite can never fully be realised unless we are prepared to cross yet another Rubicon, which is the idea that women's wombs should not be for rent and that babies should not be for sale.
Cool. Well said. I want to take you down a slightly different path, if I may. I actually really want to go back to my first question, I guess, which was around the early days of that time on council. So you went onto council and you mentioned in your book, you stood up at that meeting and you said that if I'm elected, I will stand against the establishment of brothels. That moment catapulted you in some ways into the city council, and you had a very different view to your then mayor at the time. So how did that relationship work? Because you also said in your book that you really enjoyed that time.
Yeah.
So how did that relationship work? How did that sculpt you? How did you work within that arena that almost wasn't on the same side as you?
Yeah, look, it was interesting. I really admired so much about Di Thorley, who was the mayor during the 6.5 years that I was on the council. And it was interesting when that brothel debate came up. She never actually publicly opposed me. In fact, I just can't remember the exact voting records now, but I did win a vote in those early months on council, where the council actually supported me to take a motion to the Local Government Association saying that local councils should have autonomy over whether or not there should be brothels in the city. So I got support from the council at the time. She never came out and spoke publicly against me on it, but behind the scenes, whenever I brought these issues up, there was a lot of angst and a lot of unhappiness, and shut up, Lyle. The pressure to shut up was enormous right from the get-go. And that only intensified in the years ahead as we got into a debate about, government changes to strip clubs and what, I won't mention it on the broadcast, but it's in the book, very graphic changes, for the way women could be used to entertain men. I mean, the most, despicable acts to demean women for men's entertainment. And and again, I had to make decisions. Do I just put up my hand and wave these things through quietly, or do you say, no, this is unjust? And so Di Thorley and I had an interesting relationship. So, I didn't spend my whole time on moral issues on council. These things came up periodically over the 6 years. Most of the time we were talking about stormwater drainage and off-leash dog parks, all the stuff that makes local government work. So, and on so many of those issues, Di and I agreed. And I used to love, early in the morning, she'd be at City Hall early. I'd often go up early and have a coffee on the balcony with her while she was a chain smoker, particularly before she got into meetings. And we would talk. And there were so many things that we agreed with. And I would infuriate her. She would yell at me at times. But then she'd be fine the next day. And I think as a Christian, God gave me the grace for that. I suppose I could take great offence and say, well, I'm never going to talk to you again because you got mad at me. But I just really felt to keep the relationship going. After I'd left council, she was running a pub in Tasmania. I drove down and had lunch with her because I just wanted to just keep the relationship going. Now, she said some not nice things about me in Lec Blaine's article in the Monthly last year. That was disappointing to me. She's never said those things to my face. But if I saw her again, I would go and say, hi Di, you know, let's have a coffee or something, and she'd probably yell at me for the first 5 minutes, and then we'd be friends again. You know, the Bible's whole thing of a gentle answer turns away wrath, I think, is true. And so I would hope there'd always be, you know, from my point of view, there's always a bridge and an openness to relationship.
You mentioned, it's interesting, you mentioned moral issues just then. I think there can be a perception, I don't have a quote on it, but I think there's a bit of a perception that perhaps you seem to advocate more vocally and consistently on moral issues than perhaps social justice issues. How do you feel about that?
What do you mean by social justice?
Well, okay, whilst you were at the ACL, and this was the only data I could find at the time, so I apologise, but it's between April 2013 and April 2015. So during that time, in terms of national media releases, there were 18 on same-sex marriage compared to just 1 on Indigenous issues, 2 on the poor, and only 3 on refugee status. I mean, it seems like moral issues were weighted higher than perhaps social justice issues.
Can I just ask why, and I'm happy to, I'm not trying to dodge the question, why the injustice for children that we have just discussed, why that's not a social justice issue?
I believe it is a social justice issue.
Okay.
100%. It's
why
a
did
social
you
justice
define
issue
it as a moral issue?
because the issue at the time was same-sex marriage. What you're talking, I would suggest...
No, the issue for me, and the issue for ACL was justice for children, and also justice for freedom of speech and freedom of religion, which are casualties of the change to the definition of marriage in law.
Sure, but the issue of freedom of speech, that comes up
nothing to do with anyone's personal morality.
Yeah, that's fine. But that comes up in any piece of legislation. I mean, that came up when you were arguing whether or not council should be independent before the Beattie government to make decisions around brothels. I mean, that issue can come. The issue of freedom of speech can come into any problem.
I just want to push back on. Don't get me wrong. Look, ACL has a very proud track record as advocating for what some Christians just call social justice issues.
Sure.
I spent a lot of time. I was on Reverend Tim Costello's Australian Church's Gambling Task Force. We fought very hard against poker machines. We were one of the few groups to do so. We were very instrumental in the decision to bring in another 12,000 Syrian refugees to Australia. We advocated not just for Christian refugees, but for any persecuted religious minorities. We spent a lot of time. We're one of the only groups who lobbied consistently for an increase in our overseas aid budget for the poor. So we did a lot of work in those spaces. What the statistics you read out were statistics which the same-sex marriage lobby would throw back at us to try and discredit us. Now, how many media releases did they put out on anything other? They had one organisation for 10 years devoted to one thing. They did nothing else. We at ACL had to walk and chew gum. Now, I reject the premise of your question that that there's somehow some difference between moral issues and social justice issues. Every issue that I have argued in the public square, I have done so because it is a social justice issue. It is an issue of justice to women, whether they are degraded by men in brothels. And there are many feminists. I have feminist friends to this day who are not Christians, who are so grateful for the lesbian feminist atheists who are grateful to the Australian Christian lobby because we stood up on something which we were derided for as a moral issue, but they see as a social justice issue. I see as a social justice issue. Commercial surrogacy, which is a consequence of same-sex marriage, is a social justice issue. Human rights for the unborn is not a moral issue, it's a social justice. Now, let me just reframe. All of these issues are moral issues. Whether the poor are fed is a moral issue. Whether the unborn are killed is a moral issue. Whether women are coerced into abortion, as they so often are, is a moral issue. Whether women are degraded in strip clubs is a moral issue. But all of these issues are social justice issues because social justice is a moral issue. And quite frankly, I'm a bit tired of some in the church who are happy to take the trendy issues, like poker machines, like overseas aid, like feeding the poor, agree for all these issues, and somehow say that they are more virtuous because they fight in those issues, and then diss the ACL or people like myself because we take on the harder issues, which put us against the culture, which then allow people to pigeonhole us and characterise us as evil, bad people because we're on the so-called... No, we have bought into lies about morality and about justice, and I think we need to redefine the terms, and I think the church has made some big category errors there, and that's part of the reason why the church was so ineffective as one of the most important social and cultural debates of our time happened, and we lost it, and it was completely avoidable because we were too scared to take on difficult issues in our society and culture. Now the consequences are massive, and our kids are going to bear the consequences of that, and persecution is coming as a result of our silence.
You say it was avoidable, but yet even in your book you say that you didn't think that you would win it going in. Was that because you think the church was silent?
Yeah, only because we had failed to act in the 10 to 20 years before that. Now, I came to the party, 10 years, 13 or 14 years before that, so when I personally got involved.
Yep.
But in the 10 years that I was at ACL in the lead up to the loss of marriage, we were begging the church. We were saying, this is coming. We were monitoring what was going on overseas. This is a global movement. They were networked globally. They were funded globally by the likes of people like George Soros. There was no secrets about their agenda, but because people wanted to appear loving and not bigots and not haters, and had bought into the narrative that the left and the media were characterising Christians of, and also because our theology said, oh well, let's not worry about those issues. Let's just focus on preaching the gospel. We sadly sat out of the debate until about 5 minutes to midnight, as I say in the book. And it was too late then. Now it was still right to fight, and I'm glad for those who did come in, whether early or late. It was right to raise up a standard and to say to our fellow countrymen, we are making a big mistake. And look, I think many Australians, are starting to realise that now. But we've made a mistake. It's going to take a while for us to unravel the consequences of this mistake.
I'm very conscious of your time, and I have time for one question, if I can. And this is more around, the Bible instructs us to pray for our leaders, and I believe we do so, and I would hope every church does so diligently. But this question I want to ask you was, how much does the soul of a nation pretend, as one way of putting it, how much does the soul of a nation change depending on the Prime Minister? I mean, as a country we went from Kevin Rudd, who identified as a Christian, to Julia Gillard, who was an atheist, and then, Rudd came back, but Tony Abbott, who was, unfairly perhaps given the term the Mad Monk, Malcolm Turnbull, who was Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, and perhaps when it suited him more so, and then to Scott Morrison. How does the PM change the soul of a nation?
It's a really good question. Leadership is incredibly important, whether it's in a local church, whether it's in a nation, and leaders certainly do set a tenor, and who they are as people matters. So I think it's incredibly important. I think it's important to pray for them. I think you can have leaders that do the right thing even if they're not Christians. Like the pilot of an airliner doesn't have to be a Christian to follow the laws of aerodynamics to make sure that plane flies correctly. And in some ways, the leader of a nation is the same. If they follow the principles that God has put into the world, that can be a good thing. But look, I think it's great if there is someone of faith there, because they bring someone of Christian faith, because they bring the Christian virtues and apply that. And I believe the Christian virtues are the best for human flourishing and the common good, and for the administration of justice and peace that everyone wants. I can't think of any other religion that provides that. And I mentioned this in the book. The American founders knew this. They were the first to experiment in democracy, and I've quoted some of them, but they all said that this experiment in democracy and freedom and government of the people by the people won't work unless there's virtue. You won't have virtue unless the Christian religion is at the basis of people's lives. And I think that's what we need to get back to as a nation. And so it's great that we've got a Christian Prime Minister, but even more so, we need to return to virtue and Christianity in our nation, because we can only have freedom and human flourishing if that's the basis of our nation.
Beautiful. Thank you. We're going to leave it right there. You can get Lyle Shelton's book online, or of course you can pick it up, if you're at the church, but by the time this airs, you'll be gone. You can pick it up online. It's definitely available. A great read. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a privilege. Well, I hope you enjoyed that discussion with Pastor Jaira. I certainly did, and thanks very much to him and to the Cairns Baptist Church. They're a great community up there in our far north. Well, as you know, I've written a book. It's called I Kid You Not, Notes from 20 Years in the Trenches of the Culture War. and I'm pleased to say it's selling really well. More than 1,500 copies have flown out the door. Thanks to so many of you readers who purchased extra copies to allow me to send them to politicians. This week, 130 of my books went to parliamentarians all over the nation, thanks to your support. If you haven't got your copy of the book, I really encourage you to get it. I'm so passionate about the message. It contains stories that you would not normally hear through the mainstream media. Miranda Devine, who wrote a fantastic recommendation for the book, she said the stories will set your hair on fire. I tell how terrible legislation and harmful public policy has found its way through our parliaments as good people have failed to act when they should have. It's got some lessons for our time, and I'm sure it will inspire you to be more active and vocal. So get your copy of I Kid You Not at lyleshelton.com.au. Well, that's it for this week's edition of the Lyle Shelton Show. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your support of The Good Source, and I look forward to your company again next week. Goodbye.
The Lyle Shelton Show is a production of The Good Source, hosted by Lyle Shelton. To watch, listen to, or read more content without the SJW PC fact filter, visit goodsource.news. Good, SAUCE.news. Become a Good Source supporter for exclusive access to live and unedited interview recordings, including the conversations before and after the show.